Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, thank you for finding me. I'm glad to have you. If you could subscribe, that would be a huge help. Thank you very much. And leave us a comment, please. There's apparently a new drinking game where every time I say comment, you have to take a shot or a sip, because I do talk about it a lot, but I do really like the comments. So there's another one. Ding! Gotta take another shot now. But I'm in a different room. I'm sitting sideways again. There's a lot of lights in this room, and my glasses have these huge lenses, I know, and it's like I'm getting all this glare, but this is the best angle for the least amount of glare, so I do apologize that there is a lot of reflection here, but trust me when I say that I tried to minimize it as much as possible. What are we here to talk about today? I actually have the press release for this movie. Skinny Tiger, Fatty Dragon, hell yes, this is coming out from Eureka on February 21st of 2022. It is a 2K remaster from the original film sources, and this is a UK Blu-ray debut. It is a UK company, obviously, Eureka, so it's a Region B Blu-ray, just so you know that up front in case you're in a different region and you don't have a region-free player or what have you. So I'm going to section this review into multiple pieces because there's a lot to discuss here. I have 3 pages worth of notes in my notebook. I had never seen this film before, and if you watch this channel, you'll know I'm a huge fan of Sammo, and I'm a huge fan of those like late 90s or late 80s, early 90s like cop movies and criminal movies and heroic bloodshed films and stuff like that. So I was just so excited to watch this movie. I have a lot to talk to you about, kind of my impressions of first seeing this film, but then I also want to review the Blu-ray too. Now, the first press of these, the first 3,000 copies of this release will come with a slipcase, which you can see in the picture here, and it'll come with the bonus disc, which has the I Am the White Tiger feature-length documentary film about Mark Houghton, who is a British martial artist and actor who is in this film, is in other Hong Kong films, who was a pupil of Lau Kar-leung, like the absolute legend of Shaw Brothers martial arts films. Lau Kar-wing actually directed this film, who's the brother of Lau Kar-leung. I'm not going to review that documentary in this video because I'm worried that this video is already going to be like 25 minutes. I don't want to make like a 40-minute long video. I really don't. And so I'm going to do a separate video where I talk about that documentary. So to give you basic information, and also to tell you, I guess I should tell you up front how I'm going to segment the video. I'm going to talk about my impressions, like I said, and then I'm going to segue into a Blu-ray review. Then I'm going to review the Blu-ray. But right up front, basic information. I mean, honestly, this release is like, in a nutshell, why I love Eureka and why I think a lot of you love Eureka too. The movie looks incredible. Everyone comments on that. Even Bobby Samuels, who is he's good friends with Sammo. He's American and he lived in Hong Kong and made movies for a while there. And he does a commentary track with Frank Zheng on here, and he says in the audio commentary, like, I can't believe this is a Hong Kong movie made in 1990 and it looks like this. Like, this is top quality. Like, it's one, like I said this about My Heart Is That Eternal Rose as well. That Blu-ray, incredible print. You have to pinch yourself. You can't believe it's real as you're watching it. You're like, this is like, we're so used to watching these movies on DVD or VCD or VHS and like all these formats where it's like grainy and it's dark and you can't see anything and the colors are weird and the audio is terrible and it's like kind of astounding. And on top of that, you get the really cool packaging. You get the limited booklet with all the awesome information, the essay there. You get an entire documentary as a bonus feature on top of a bunch of other awesome bonus features. It's just like, it's amazing to be alive right now, to be a fan of Hong Kong cinema, and to be treated to these releases. And I spent about 2 or 3 days watching everything on here, and it was just such joy for me. I just loved it. I love this release. Part of that comes down to the fact that I love these types of movies. I'll talk about that again in a second. Very basic information about this movie. Like I said, it came out in 1990. It's directed by Lau Kar-wing, who himself is a legend of Shaw Brothers and old school martial arts and stuff like that, and also the brother of Lau Kar-leung, who's one of like the ultimate legends of Shaw Brothers and martial arts films and stuff like that. And it stars Sammo Hung and Carl Maka. Carl Maka being hugely famous himself from like Aces Go Places, and he was a producer, like a huge producer, but also, like a big actor. And Sammo Hung. And so the three of them really came together on this project. And Carrie Ng is in it too. Who's in? I think she's like, from my impression, she's most well known from being in like a bunch of Category 3 films. I think she was in Sex and Zen, and she's in Naked Killer, I believe, and like other stuff of that nature. And I'm just trying to make sure that I covered all the basics here. And I came out in the summer of 1990. So one of the things that a lot of people have been pointing out is that some of the artwork used on this release, which I believe is the original poster artwork from Hong Kong, is identical to something that's in Total Recall. And this movie actually came out like within a few days or weeks or something of Total Recall in theaters. But the Total Recall trailers had been out, and like obviously they probably saw because that imagery has nothing to do with this movie, right? They obviously got it from Total Recall because it's not in this movie at all. But it's kind of cool, like to see the exchange of ideas, the theft, if you want to call it that. So to give you my impressions of this film, it's so fun. That's what I loved about it. It's not like a perfect movie. It's not a 5-star movie. If you're waiting to hear that it's like the great lost masterpiece of like Hong Kong cinema, it's not really that. Like tonally, I would say it's kind of like Dragons Forever. It has that kind of lighthearted comedy of like a movie like Police Story, but then it has some like serious violence, and it does get kind of serious, and it gets pretty brutal. It's not like over the top, like people being ripped to pieces and broken bones and stuff, but like the violence is not like, oh haha, funny lighthearted violence. Like the fight scenes hit hard, and I actually really liked that about it. Like glass breaking, people thrown into tables, like Sammo's fighting like at this construction site, and Sammo's like beating people with metal poles, and like blood comes out when there are gunshots, and like it's kind of harder edged in the violence, but it's a buddy cop movie. And so it has that kind of maybe like Police Story 2 type tone where it is harder edged and darker, but it's also kind of light and comedic. It's so dated. And I say that in a good way. I was a kid in 1990. So like, for instance, Sammo Hung has a windbreaker in this movie. And I'm like, I think I had the exact same jacket or like something really similar to it. And like, the music is so like late 80s, early 90s. The graphics on the title cards, like it's such a timepiece in like this really great way that if you were alive then, you remember everything, and it invokes so much nostalgia. But then if you weren't alive, then you get that feeling of that era, and you can kind of live it through what you're seeing on the screen and stuff like that. So it's really great in that sense, and amazing locations all around Hong Kong. I'm a location junkie, and like I love seeing the city and preserved so well in this amazing remaster, like I said, 2K remaster. It just looks incredible. And to go back to the dated stuff, I just remembered something I wanted to talk about. There are multiple scenes in this movie where Carl Maka and Sammo Hung end up at like places where VHS tapes are being rented. And you can see the covers like really well. Like I saw RoboCop, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. And I saw No Way Out, the Kevin Costner film. And there's some Japanese adult films, which at first I was like, is that porn? Like, what? It's just like in a convenience store. And I'm like, are they renting porn? And then Arna Venema actually talks about how they're like Japanese erotic films and stuff like that. There's a huge swastika actually on one of the VHS cases, and Mike Leader in the commentary track says it's like a Nazi sexploitation film. It's like, what are they renting at this convenience store? Oh my God. But yeah. Yeah, I really liked it. I just really enjoy it. Like the nostalgia, the comfort food nature of a film like this. I mean, Lau Kar Wing, like I said, Shaw Brothers legend. Sammo Hung, absolute legend of Hong Kong cinema. And then you have Ridley Choi, who did the fights, who's like, a legendary fight choreographer, and Mark Houghton is in the film, like I said. Like all these people coming together, collaborating on choreography. Like the fights are just so fun. And you're not going to watch it and be like, this movie changed my life. Like I was thinking about this earlier. Like if I had to rate this movie, I think I would give it a 3.5 out of 5. That's kind of like a weird, like a 3 to me is like, I enjoyed that. Maybe I'll watch it again. I'm not upset that I watched it. It was really fun, whatever. And a 4 to me is like, oh, approaching legendary status. This movie is like right in between that to me, where like, it really is just pure fun entertainment. It's not revelatory. It's not going to change your life, but it's so fun. And the fights are so good. and it's just really goofy. And there's like there's a lot of comedy in this movie. It didn't always land to me. Like some of the jokes, I was kind of like, whatever. But some of it was just, I actually wrote down. Let me see if I can, because I don't want to forget anything. I'm doing another late night video. I don't know if you can tell if my mind seems focused, but oh right, yeah. So there's a scene where Carl Maka and Sammo Hung are chasing a bad guy, and they end up in like a restaurant, and everyone's like really formally dressed, and they're like beating the crap out of this guy. They're like throwing him through tables and like smashing him against the wall, and then it turns out it's their boss's wedding. And they've like chased him into the wedding and just like destroyed the wedding. It's really funny. That's a minor spoiler. I apologize for that. But there's like a lot of really funny moments throughout the movie like that. And there's like classic 1990 Hong Kong WTF moments where you're like, what? Like they go to Singapore? I'll talk more about that when I talk about the bonus features, but they just kind of like go to Singapore and then they run into, and when I say run into, I mean they literally run into on the street like two of the most attractive people you've ever seen in your life. And then they just hang out with them on like a yacht and do karaoke with them and stuff. So good, because it's so like, what is happening? Like that kind of stuff would never be in like a Hollywood movie from that period. And then there's actually also, there's a subplot where one of the bad guys hires trans assassins. So like Thai lady boys, I think is the impolite way to say that. Or get the dated way to say that, I guess. But like they hire trans assassins from Thailand. And one of the things that's really interesting about this movie to me is that they hired trans actors from Thailand to play these parts, and they show them nude. And I thought that was, because usually you don't see nudity in these films, but also to have like totally unjudgmental nudity of trans actors from that time period, especially in a film, and I will talk about this later, that is really not PC. I thought that was really interesting. It was really interesting to see that, and that was something that I really enjoyed about this movie, was that really non-judgmental attitude. But I mean, obviously you could make the argument that like they're using them as like trying to find humor or trying to find jokes in it. But when I watched this movie, I did not see that they were belittling these characters or saying anything lesser of them or using them as the butt of jokes or anything like that. And so I thought it was really interesting to see that in this movie from that time period. So I think I can stop there with my kind of, it's just solid entertainment. If you love Sammo Hung, if you love these types of movies, if you love Carl Maka, Lau Kar Wing, it's just a really fun movie. It's a movie I've already watched it I think 4 times in the past few days, because I watched the 2 commentary tracks, and then I rewatched like select scenes just to kind of like recheck stuff out. So and then I'm gonna edit clips from it too, so I will have watched it like what 4.5 times like in the past week or so. So, and it's a movie I will watch again. It's a good movie to own, especially in this edition with all the bonus material. So to transition into the bonus material, I wanted to retouch upon what I said about how this movie is really dated and it's very not PC. And what I thought was really interesting is that everyone in the bonus material who's commenting upon the film has kind of different things to say about that. Like Frank Zhang and Bobby Samuels. Bobby Samuels having been like, you know, like I said, a friend of Sammo Hung, who is American. The two of them kind of talk about how you could never make this movie today, not only because it has this kind of dated, very kind of sexist attitude, but also because it's very critical. Maybe not critical is the wrong way to put it, but it makes the police out to be these like bumbling, aggressive morons who are totally inept. And you can't do that anymore in Hong Kong. Like there are laws against criticizing the police in films and stuff like that. James Oliver in his essay, and James Oliver does a really tremendous job of contextualizing this film, especially in Sammo Hung's career, but in all of their careers, and why was it made, and his information and it contradicts some of the stuff that is said in other places in here. I'm not going to say who's right or wrong because I don't know, obviously, because I wasn't there and I didn't make these decisions. I wasn't part of this film. But it is really interesting to see that perspective about the historical context, how the movie came into being. And he talks about the kind of sexist attitudes and the dated kind of I would say that Frank and Bobby Samuels are just kind of looking at it objectively, saying that's, that's the way it was then, and James Oliver is more kind of taking a critical look at, and kind of being like a negative critical look at the film because of some of these elements. I mean, it's like the classic kind of that era, 1990, like sexual harassment kind of stuff of like the men just talking about women constantly and like oogling over them and like being totally inappropriate. And there's a joke about AIDS, which is interesting because Undeclared War, also released in 1990, the Ringo Lam film, has a reference to AIDS. So it's the same year. And so speaking of the Mike Leader and Arna Venema, Mike on their commentary track, Mike Leader talks about AIDS in Hong Kong because he moved to Hong Kong. This is really awesome. 2 days before this movie came out. And he saw it in theaters. I think Mark Houghton brought him to a midnight screening of this film, like when it came out, which is so cool. It was like a preview screening, right? So I'll talk more about that when I get into depth on their commentary. But Mike Leader talks about how there was a very, very, very non-PC attitude about AIDS and kind of everything in general at that point in Hong Kong, and that especially in movies, it wasn't always meant to be serious. Like, they weren't trying to be hurtful or seriously offensive. It was an attitude thing of like just being outlandish and ridiculous and poking at people and kind of having this like fuck you attitude, but it not being like a serious fuck you attitude, of more like a tongue-in-cheek, isn't this absurd, isn't this ridiculous, like, let's be as outlandish and offensive as possible, because then people will go and tell their friends about it and everyone will go see our movie. Like, I don't think that this movie is deliberately, maliciously, intentionally offensive. I think part of it, as Mike Leader explains, but you can kind of see this when you watch this movie, is this kind of self-aware, almost like tongue-in-cheek, like let's piss people off kind of thing. And from what I understand, obviously I don't know Sammo Hung personally. I've heard a lot of stories about Sammo Hung from a lot of people who do know Sammo Hung, and apparently part of Sammo Hung's thing is he just does not give a shit what anyone thinks about him. And he gets a kick out of being outlandish and ridiculous and offensive just to see how people will react to it. And that's really interesting to me. So, and again, I don't know if that's true, but you hear these things through the rumor mill and stuff like that. So to get into the bonus material here, there's a Lau Kar-wing interview, which is 25 minutes long, which is excellent. He talks about like his dad being a martial artist and doing choreography, and his brother being so famous and like really envying his brother, and how he first got into martial arts and how he first met Carl Maka and Sammo Hung, and because they had collaborated in the 70s. And they knew each other for years and years and years when they made this film. And he talks about how like they wanted to work together again, and Carl Maka was really more into the comedy than the martial arts. And when Carl Maka actually saw the first cut of the film, he wanted to take martial arts out and then do some reshoots and then edit the scenes around to emphasize the comedy more. And what's interesting is that Sammo Hung has 3 different hairstyles in this movie, and they're all totally different. And it almost feels like it's deliberately edited to mess with your head because it switches like every scene. But then when you hear that they did reshoots and stuff like that, it makes total sense, right? So I'm just looking at my notes here. One of the things that Lau Kar-wing talked about that I thought was really interesting was the evolution of martial arts choreography, and how in the 70s, when they would choreograph fight scenes, it would be this very logical thing of like, this person is doing this hold on me, so I have to do that, and then this other thing to get them off of me, push them away from me, create distance, attack them in this new way. Like, it was all very much about actual martial arts and like the minutia of the logic of how you would do things. And by the time you got to 1990, it was just like chaos, because Jackie Chan really pushed it in this direction of just like fists and feet flying everywhere, people being thrown through the air, as many people in a fight as possible. And it was like this brawling, chaotic, violent style that was less about the mechanics and the logic of martial arts. And that was really interesting. He also talks about how in the 70s they didn't have cool equipment. So like on one movie he made in the 70s, they wanted a crane shot, so they tied the camera to a string and just pulled it to like get the effect of a crane. Whereas when he made this movie, they had access to all this equipment, and like I think they took Ridley Choi in his interview says they took 4 months to make this movie, and an entire month was dedicated to the final fight, which I think is like the final sequence, I guess I should say, that all takes place in one location. I think it's about 15 minutes long or 20 minutes long. And it's multiple scenes and fights all kind of like together. But, they had a lot of resources and stuff because of how successful everyone was. And it was very relaxed atmosphere on set and everything like that. But it's a really great interview. Oh, and actually, I should also say that Lau Kar Wing talks about Bruce Lee. Now, if you're familiar with this film, you'll know that Sammo Hung is actually doing a Bruce Lee homage in the fight scenes. He's imitating Bruce Lee. And Lau Kar Wing talks about how he met Bruce Lee before Bruce Lee was famous, and he was really nice and humble, and he was really impressed with Bruce Lee's martial arts. So I thought that was really interesting. So that's actually a really good segue into the Ridley Choi interview, because Ridley Choi talks about how Lau Kar Wing, Ridley Choi is the fight choreographer for the film and is also in the film as the henchman to the bad guy. Ridley Choi talks about how he and Lau Kar Wing talked before making the film about how Lau Kar Wing wanted like a hard-hitting film. He wanted it to be modern, and he wanted it to be hard-hitting. And they talked about Bruce Lee and how Bruce Lee's style was very hard-hitting and impactful. And that really came across on the screen, the power of it. And so Ridley Choi kind of was looking at the story and was like, Sammo's character kind of reminded him of Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee was very hard hitting, and he and Lau Kar Wing had discussed Bruce Lee, and he knew that Sammo had done the Bruce Lee impersonation in Enter the Fat Dragon. So he actually, according to Ridley Choi's interview, he came up with the idea that Sammo would do his Bruce Lee impersonation in this film. And he talked to Sammo about it. Sammo was like, yeah, I really like that idea. Talked to Lau Kar Wing about it. Everyone was on the same page. And then Ridley Choi actually went and watched all the Bruce Lee movies like over and over again to familiarize himself with that style, to try to choreograph fights around it. But he also says that the fight choreography was very collaborative, and that Sammo was doing a lot of his own, like little fights that Sammo would have, or like Sammo's fight with Mark Houghton and stuff like that. Like Ridley Choi would be off organizing like the huge groups of stunt performers and all that stuff. And Sammo would be kind of doing his own little fight scenes. And it was interesting to hear how they work together. He talks about his career as well in this interview. He started Peking opera at 7 because his dad was a Peking opera guy. He was 12 when he started doing movies, which is crazy to me. And then he worked his way up because he wanted to be a filmmaker, and so he would volunteer. He was a stunt performer, and then he would get little acting jobs, and then he would start doing fight choreography, and he would volunteer to do like any job on any movie set, just to be like constantly involved. My favorite bit of the Ridley Choi interview is when he talks about how Sammo knocked him out on this movie. So the story is that there's a scene where Sammo's character does like a jumping kick into the Ridley Choi character's face. And Ridley Choi was like, I don't want Sammo, because Sammo was like his hero. He's like, I don't want Sammo to think I'm like weak or I don't have guts or whatever. So I'm going to have him actually hit me, because I know that's Sammo's style, because he likes to actually hit to get that hard impact on screen. And so what he did was he had his assistant, Ridley Choi had his own assistant, practice the move with him. He's like, Sammo, it's going to be like this. Check it out. This is what you're going to do to me. And the guy did it and kicked him, and he was like, okay, yeah, like it hurt a little bit, but it was okay, whatever. So then they're like, okay, roll camera. Sammo's going to do it. And Sammo just like walloped the shit out of him and kicked him into a wall. And knocked him out, and it's in the movie. So you just see Sammo like hammering him and knocking him out. Anyway, but it's really funny to hear him tell that story. So there's also an audio-only interview with Mark Houghton, who, like I said, is in this film. He's British. He's a martial artist. The whole documentary, I Am the White Tiger, which is disc 2 of this release, which I will be discussing separately, is on this film, or in this set, all about him. And his interview is really cool. So he was a pupil of Lau Kar Lung, who is Lau Kar Wing's brother, and he talks about how Lau Kar Lung was like really intense and expected the best out of everyone all the time, and Lau Kar Wing was like a little bit more laid back. And even though he had very high levels of expectation, I think it seemed to, from what I inferred from what Mark Houghton was saying, Lau Kar Wing would hire the people he knew could live up to his expectations, and then he was actually pretty chill on the set of the film, and he wasn't as intense as his brother had a tendency to be. Mark Houghton talks about the differences between working with Jackie and Sammo, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not going to spoil that for you. You should just go and pick up the set and listen to what he says. But the other thing that I really enjoyed about his little section is that he talks about how Sammo as with Ridley Choi, actually kicked the shit out of him. But Sammo asked, he's like, look, I want to do this kick. It's going to be really hard. I'm really going to kick you. Is it okay? And Mark Houghton said yes. And they did the take, and Sammo like hammered him. He said he was seeing stars for like 10 minutes. He got hit so hard. But then he said Sammo paid him for a whole week after he was done rapping as a thank you for letting him kick him that hard. Like Mark Houghton just hung out on the set. His part was already shot, and he got paid every day, and that was Sammo's thank you. So I thought that was really cool to hear that little anecdote. So that's the Mark Houghton bit. There is an 8.5 minute long fight scene that is it's like extended footage from the fight at the end of the movie with Lau Kar-wing, who's in the movie as well, I should say. Lau Kar-wing plays the villain. So Lau Kar-wing, Ridley Choi, Mark Houghton, Sammo Hung, it's like extended footage from all those fights going on at the end of the movie. It's taken from a Taiwanese DVD because they were unable to find like the original film materials from that interview. So it's not like HD remastered, but it's still really, really cool to be able to see that. So the last two things I have to talk about here are the Bobby Samuels and Frank Zhang commentary, and then the Mike and Arna one. So Bobby Samuels, like I said, is an American who went to Hong Kong. He's a martial artist. He went there to be in films. And he lived with Sammo, I think, at some point. He taught himself Cantonese. And I was so impressed, honestly, by hearing him and Frank Zhang talking in Cantonese on the audio track that I decided to learn Cantonese. So I downloaded an app. So you want to hear I have just very, very few Cantonese. And I have to say, I'm just listening to an app and then trying my best to say what the app is saying. So my pronunciation is probably horrible. So I apologize. I'm not trying to say I'm like the world's foremost expert in Cantonese, but I just decided to embarrass myself in this video by speaking my phrases that I have learned. So, Ngoy doze, which those come together in like the little listening thing, like the little voice on there says Ngoy doze, which I think that one means thank you, but I think Ngoy also means please. I think it means both. And then the other thing I learned, according to this app, which might even be wrong, I don't know, is you're welcome, which is Sai ha he, Sai ha he. The voice on the app is a woman with a high-pitched voice. So, like, I'm imitating her and doing it, like higher than I feel like I should. But I've been trying to hear, you know, obviously all these movies were dubbed in, like, the 80s and stuff. But the voice that I hear for Sammo Hung, which I'm guessing is a dubbed voice, is, like, what I'm trying to hear when I do it. So, like, Sai ha he, that's, like, how I think I would hear Sammo say it. But anyway, there's my terrible Cantonese. I have embarrassed myself. I just wanted to do that. Bobby Samuels is like my new favorite person, and his rapport with Frank Zhang is so good, and he knows so much about these films. He has such a passion for them. He's so smart, and it is so insightful. It was just really, really awesome to hear that commentary track. And I have not seen most of the Hong Kong films that Bobby Samuels was in, so I've already ordered 2 on DVD. I got on eBay right after I finished watching that commentary track and ordered a couple. So I'll have reviews of those hopefully coming to the channel at some point. But Frank's voice is kind of blown out, actually. I noticed that, and then I talked to Frank about it, and he's like, yeah, there was a bunch of smog or something in New York City, and it messed up his voice. But there's just, you know, Frank knows so much. And Bobby Samuels has such great insight into martial arts and filmmaking, and Sammo. Like, he knows Sammo really well. So he talks about, like, how Sammo's feelings about Bruce Lee, for instance, because, you know, he's doing the Bruce Lee homage here. And he has a lot of insight into Sammo's character that was really fascinating. You know, like Frank talks about Carl Maka is famous for having like this accent that was actually the guy who was dubbing him who had an accent, but then that voice kept following Carl Maka throughout his career because he became famous for it, even though it wasn't his voice. And like really interesting insight into stuff like that. Bobby Samuels talks about how Sammo knocked his tooth out on a movie they did together. So that's a really fun story. There's actually some surprises in this commentary track. I'm not going to spoil those for you, but they're awesome. Blackie Ko did the car stunts for this movie. I didn't know that. So, you know, he's like pretty famous, and he's in some older movies like the Jimmy Wang Yu. I think he's in One Armed Boxer. But he was famous for doing car stunts. And so they talk about his career and stuff like that. And Bobby Samuels just tells his story about how he ended up in Hong Kong, and Frank talks a lot about like Cantonese language, and actually Bobby too, since he speaks Cantonese. They talk about like what certain things mean literally versus how they're translated in the subtitles, and it's just like it's so insightful, and I loved their report. I'm really excited to hear more from them because I think they did the Warriors 2 and Prodigal Son, which I haven't watched yet, which reviews will be coming soon to the channel. And then finally, this video is getting so long, and I thank you so much for bearing with me here. We have the Mike Leader and Arna Venema commentary. So like I said, Mike Leader arrived in Hong Kong 2 days before this movie came out. And he talks about going to see it, and he knows everyone in this movie, and he tells you who they are, and he tells you stories about them and behind the scenes stuff. And like Arna makes really great observations about like that shot is really cool, or like the way that they edited from this to this, or like, because he's a filmmaker, so like his insight into that, I always love it. Mike talks about there's pagers in this movie, like beepers, and Mike talks about like beeper culture in Hong Kong and how like there would be phones just everywhere because everyone had like a pager, and so you would get a page, you just like walk into a restaurant, just pick up their phone, like put the money in and just talk for like hours, and like it's just really cool to get that like nostalgia and that insight. They talk about the different neighborhoods and how they've changed over the years. Arna, actually, one of the really interesting things that Arna talks about is how Hong Kong, the streets used to be really dirty, and then after SARS there became this intense awareness of like keeping things clean to avoid the spread of disease and stuff like that, and so it became a much cleaner city. So that was like a really interesting insight that I never ever would have thought of. They talk about the connecting. So there's a scene in this movie where Sammo Hung fights these guys wearing masks, and I think one of them is a Ninja Turtles mask, or somehow Ninja Turtles came up, and Arna talks about the different connections. There's several connections between Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Hong Kong, which I actually didn't know about, that I thought was really interesting to learn. The guy who plays the boss of Sammo and Carl Maka in this movie, Mike Leader, was in a commercial with, so he talks about him. And I found out that the man who takes no prisoners, Joe Ferrello himself, used to do police lineups when he first went to Hong Kong. It's like a job, like they would pay him to stand in a lineup. So that was fun. And then, so I talked about how they just randomly go to Singapore in this movie. Mike Leader talks about how travel companies would put a lot of money into movies to sponsor them to go places where they would do tours. So maybe a travel company put a bunch of money into Sammo and Carl Maka going to Singapore, and maybe, because Lau Kar Wing actually in his interview talks about how they got a bunch of money for the Singapore segment that helped fund the film. So maybe the Singapore Tourism Board and like a Hong Kong based travel agency, and maybe one of the airlines or whatever, pooled this money and put it in, and that's why that segment is in there. And that's also why you see a lot of segments in Hong Kong films from that era where they go off to other places. That was really interesting to me. So there you go. It's Skinny Tiger and Fatty Dragon, 1990. Lau Kar Wing is the director. Sammo Hung and Carl Maka and Carrie Ng are the stars. Lau Kar Wing is also in the film. Ridley Choi, Mark Houghton. I love this film. This is an incredible release from Eureka. I thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far into the video, this is a long-ass video, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot to go over here. My name is Will. This is Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society, and as always, I thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.